February 28, 1943. Night settles over the South Pacific, a black ocean broken only by the faint shimmer of moonlight on the waves. From the harbor of Rabaul, engines rumble to life. 8 Japanese troop transports and 8 destroyers slip into the dark, bound for Lae in New Guinea. Their mission: reinforce the front lines and stop the Allied advance across the island. On the decks, thousands of soldiers smoke quietly, their silhouettes framed by searchlights fading in the distance. Above them, the sky is clear. No enemy in sight. The convoy's commander believes the voyage will be swift, invisible, untouchable. But hundreds of miles away, deep inside a cramped Allied intelligence station in Australia, a different kind of battle is already underway. Men and women hunch over radio intercepts, decoding streams of Japanese naval traffic. The air smells of coffee, ink, and sweat. A single coded phrase catches an officer's eye. Coordinates that match a secret Japanese movement. Somewhere in the Pacific, a convoy is sailing straight into a trap. And the Americans already know exactly where it's going. By early 1943, the tide of the Pacific War was beginning to turn. For over a year, Japan had swept across the Western Pacific, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, from Malaya to the Solomons. Its empire stretched thousands of miles, guarded by a chain of fortified islands, and defended by a navy that had seemed unstoppable. But beneath the surface of that empire, cracks had begun to spread. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 had shattered Japan's carrier strength. 4 of its finest aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, lay at the bottom of the Pacific. The victory gave the U.S. Navy breathing room and, more importantly, belief. Now the focus of the war had shifted southwest, toward the long, brutal campaign for New Guinea. This island, sprawlys, long and mountainous, formed a natural barrier between Australia and the Japanese strongholds farther north. Whoever controlled New Guinea controlled the route to the Philippines, and eventually, the path to Japan itself. In early 1943, Japanese commanders in Rabaul faced a grim reality. Their forces on the northern coast of New Guinea were isolated and weakening. Supplies ran short. Disease spread faster than reinforcements. The only way to stabilize the front was to send men and equipment by sea, through waters now dominated by Allied aircraft based in Australia and Port Moresby. This was not a risk the Japanese Navy took lightly. American bombers and patrols prowled the Bismarck Sea, the stretch of water separating New Britain from New Guinea. Allied reconnaissance planes from the 5th Air Force had grown increasingly aggressive, raiding shipping routes and harbors almost daily. Still, Tokyo insisted the convoy must sail. On February 28, 1943, under the command of Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, 8 transport ships and 8 destroyers departed Rabaul. Their task: deliver nearly 7,000 soldiers of the Japanese 51st Division, along with vehicles, ammunition, and fuel, to the port of Lae. Once ashore, those reinforcements would mount a counteroffensive against the Australians and Americans fighting along the island's rugged spine. Kimura believed his fleet could succeed where others had failed. He planned to move only at night, under cover of tropical storms, and disperse during daylight to avoid detection. Japanese commanders trusted in secrecy and speed, the same tools that had served them so well in the early months of the war. What they didn't know was that their codes, the elaborate system of ciphers used by the Imperial Japanese Navy, were no longer secret. Inside a nondescript building in Brisbane, Australia, U.S. and Australian cryptanalysts had been working day and night on intercepted radio messages. Their operation, codenamed Ferumel, Fleet Radio Unit, Melbourne, and linked closely to the U.S. Navy's station HIPO in Hawaii, had achieved the impossible. They were reading portions of Japan's naval communications in near real time. When Kimura's orders were transmitted from Rabaul, the Allies knew. They knew the number of ships, the departure time, and even the planned route through the Bismarck Sea. To the Japanese, it was a well-guarded operation. To the Americans, It was a target painted in light. At Port Moresby, General George C. Kenney, commander of the Allied 5th Air Force, was handed the decoded information. It was more than intelligence. It was opportunity. Kenney immediately began coordinating a strike force. Squadrons of B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-25 Mitchells, and A-20 Havocs, backed by Australian Beaufighters. They trained for low-level attack runs, learning how to skip bombs across the surface of the sea, a daring new technique designed to strike ships at point-blank range. To Kenney and his men, the upcoming battle was not just another mission. It was a chance to prove that air power alone could destroy an enemy fleet, something no air force in history had yet accomplished. Across the Pacific, in the dark halls of Rabaul, Admiral Kimura's convoy steamed forward, unaware that its secret had already been stolen. The ocean around them seemed calm. The air was heavy with salt and rain, but unseen above the clouds, American reconnaissance aircraft were already circling, watching every move. The Bismarck Sea, once a lifeline for Japan's war in New Guinea, was about to become a graveyard. By March 1, 1943, the Japanese convoy was deep in the Bismarck Sea, a narrow stretch of water surrounded by the Sol Islands of New Britain, New Ireland, and New Guinea. The weather was heavy with tropical rain. Visibility dropped to near zero, and the wind howled across the decks. To the Japanese, it felt like the gods of war themselves were providing cover. For Admiral Masatomi Kimura, this was ideal. The storm would keep Allied planes grounded. Every hour they remained unseen brought them closer to Leh. His destroyers steamed in 2 parallel columns, their bows cutting through the waves. The transports followed, their holds packed with men and supplies. The soldiers below deck prayed for calm seas and swift passage. But above the clouds, the storm was not enough to hide them. American reconnaissance aircraft, long-range B-24 Liberators, were scanning the sea through breaks in the weather. By mid-morning, they spotted the convoy. Photographs confirmed what Allied codebreakers already knew. 8 transports, 8 destroyers, heading straight for Leh. At Allied headquarters in Port Moresby, General George Kenney immediately recognized the moment. This was no routine engagement. This was the opportunity to cripple Japan's ability to fight in New Guinea. If the convoy reached Leh, thousands of fresh troops would reinforce the front and prolong the campaign for months. If it was destroyed, Japan's position in the Southwest Pacific could collapse. Orders went out quickly. Air crews were briefed, maps laid out, targets assigned. The skies over Port Moresby buzzed with activity. Mechanics armed aircraft with 500-pound bombs, machine gun belts, and the new untested skip-bombing ordnance, designed to bounce across the sea and strike ships just above the waterline. The technique had been pioneered only weeks earlier. Crews practiced at low altitude, flying barely 50 feet above the waves, releasing bombs that would skip like stones before exploding against a ship's hull. It was as dangerous, precise, and unorthodox, but it offered a critical advantage: accuracy against fast-moving naval targets. Meanwhile, the Japanese convoy pressed on. Their radio discipline was strict. No unnecessary transmissions, no signals that could reveal their position. Still, small fragments of communication leaked through, each one intercepted and decrypted by Allied listening stations. Every coordinate, every course correction was tracked and plotted. On the evening of March 1st, as the storm began to clear, Japanese lookouts reported flashes of light high above the horizon. Aircraft. Within minutes, bombs began to fall. The first American attack had begun, a probing strike by B-17s. From their high-altitude runs, the flying fortresses dropped waves of bombs into the sea. Most missed, but one transport took a direct hit, erupting in a column of smoke and fire. The Japanese formation tightened. Anti-aircraft guns barked into the sky, tracers slicing through the clouds. Night fell again over the Bismarck Sea. Fires burned on the water. Kimura's destroyers raced to rescue survivors while maintaining speed toward Leh. Despite the damage, Morale aboard the surviving transports remained high. The men believed they had weathered the worst. But at Port Moresby, General Kenny's airmen were only just beginning. The next day, he planned a full-scale assault. Coordinated waves of B-17s, B-25s, A-20s, and bullfighters attacking at multiple altitudes and angles. Reconnaissance would lead the strike. Heavy bombers would scatter the formation, and low-flying aircraft would finish the job. Every pilot understood the stakes. They were not just attacking ships. They were trying to change the course of the war in the Southwest Pacific. As dawn approached on March 2nd, Allied bombers lifted off from dusty airstrips, one after another, engines roaring in unison. The sky turned pale blue over New Guinea's mountains. Somewhere beyond those peaks, hidden by the sea's mist, the Japanese convoy sailed on, battered but determined. The stage was set. The hunters knew their prey, and the Pacific awaited a battle unlike any it had ever seen before. The story of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea wasn't just about ships and planes. It was about people, scattered across jungles, sea lanes, and secret rooms, each fighting a different kind of war. In the intelligence huts of Townsville, Australia, the war was fought with pencils, typewriters, and intercepted radio chatter. The cryptanalysts of Central Bureau, Australians and Americans working side by side, had learned to hear patterns in chaos. Every coded message was a fragment of a larger puzzle. Some had spent months listening to nothing but static, searching for meaning in noise. When they finally uncovered Japan's convoy movement, it was like striking gold. Their success didn't come from luck. It was the result of the long, quiet battle for Japan's naval code, JN-25. Analysts had spent years breaking it piece by piece, identifying call signs, translating ship names, and mapping signal habits. By early 1943, they could often read Japanese fleet traffic faster than Tokyo could act on it. The invisible war of the Codebreakers made the destruction of the convoy possible before the first bomb was ever dropped. In the field, leadership would determine whether that intelligence could be turned into victory. General George C. Kenny, commander of the Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific, was unlike most generals of his time. He was bold, innovative, and impatient with old rules. Kenny believed the air war in the Pacific demanded new tactics, ones that broke free of the heavy, high-altitude bombing doctrines that had dominated the war so far. Kenny's belief in skip bombing, in low-level attacks, and in aggressive coordination between bomber and fighter units became the foundation for the coming strike. Many of his pilots had never tried it in real combat. Some doubted it would even work. But Kenny trusted his men, and he trusted the data. The combination of intelligence and air power, he believed, could reshape the war's balance overnight. At the same time, on the other side of the sea, Admiral Masatomi Kimura carried a different burden. His orders from Rabaul were clear: reach Lae at all costs. Japan's ground forces in New Guinea were starving, short of ammunition, and fighting to hold back the Australian and American advance. Kimura's convoy was the lifeline. Every ship carried hundreds of troops, artillery pieces, and tons of supplies. The very foundation of Japan's campaign in the region. Kimura was a veteran sailor, experienced and cautious. He believed his destroyers, equipped with heavy anti-aircraft batteries and disciplined gunners, could protect the transports through to Lae. The convoy was spaced carefully, escorts flanking the vulnerable troopships in textbook formation. Kimura's decision to press on despite reconnaissance reports showed both courage and fatal overconfidence. He could not know that the Allies had already mapped his every movement. For the men aboard the transports, there was little sense of the danger that lay ahead. They were soldiers, not sailors, many from elite divisions of the Japanese army. They slept in crowded holds, their rifles stacked beside them, the air thick with fuel and salt. When bombs fell that first night, they cheered when the explosions missed, convinced their convoy was blessed by fortune. But on the morning of March 2nd, that illusion would vanish. Allied aircraft were forming up in tight formations over New Guinea's highlands. The sky trembled with the sound of engines. Hundreds of them. And every one of them knew exactly where the enemy was. The Allied plan for the attack on the Japanese convoy represented a new kind of warfare, a shift from doctrine to improvisation, from textbook strategy to raw innovation. General Kenny and his staff understood that traditional bombing alone would never guarantee destruction. High-altitude attacks might damage a few ships, but they wouldn't annihilate the convoy. To truly stop it, they needed to strike with precision, low, fast, and coordinated. This was where skip bombing came in. Adapted from naval gunnery concepts, it turned the ocean's surface into a weapon. Pilots would dive low, sometimes so low that their propellers almost skimmed the waves, and release bombs that would skip across the sea like stones before slamming into a ship's side. Training for this tactic had been dangerous. Many aircraft were lost in practice. Timing was everything. Release a second too early, and the bomb bounced harmlessly away. Too late, and it exploded beneath the aircraft. But when it worked, it was devastating. The bomb would pierce the hull and detonate inside, splitting the ship open like a can. The Americans also planned to use bowfighters in a new way. Instead of approaching from above, they would attack horizontally at mast height, using their 420mm cannons and 6 machine guns to shred enemy decks, disable gunners, and suppress fire just as bombers swooped in. It was a deadly ballet of precision and aggression, a coordinated assault from multiple directions that the Japanese Navy had never faced before. The Japanese, by contrast, believed their layered defense was impenetrable. Their destroyers were equipped with Type 96 anti-aircraft guns and trained to fire in overlapping patterns, creating a wall of lead around the convoy. But they had never been tested against massed low-level attacks. Most gunners were trained to track high-altitude bombers, not aircraft racing just above the water at 250 miles per hour. Their radar coverage was almost non-existent, and coordination between ships was hampered by strict radio silence. Worse still, Japanese doctrine treated air cover as a luxury, not a necessity. The convoy had been promised support from the 11th Air Fleet, but bad weather and fuel shortages kept those planes grounded. Kimura sailed blind, unaware that Allied reconnaissance was tracking every movement and that his own skies would soon belong entirely to the enemy. The difference in technology was only part of the story. Psychology played the rest. The Allies were emboldened by intelligence, innovation, and the belief that air power could change the war. The Japanese were fighting a war they no longer controlled, governed by assumptions formed when their empire still expanded across the Pacific. For years, Japan's naval convoys had sailed without serious threat. Their early war dominance had created a culture of invincibility, one that blinded them to how quickly the Allies were adapting. The Bismarck Sea would reveal just how dangerous that complacency had become. As March 2nd dawned, the tactical pieces were in place. Allied aircrews climbed into their cockpits, faces painted with the pale glow of morning. Maps were folded, targets memorized, formations aligned. In the air, the first B-17s led the way, flying high to scatter the convoy and draw anti-aircraft fire. Behind them, the low-level attackers prepared to strike. Below, on the black waters of the Bismarck Sea, Admiral Kimura's formation cut through the waves, confident, disciplined, unaware. They were about to learn what happens when information, innovation, and air power converge in perfect synchrony. March 3rd, 1943. Dawn broke over the Bismarck Sea with a thin, golden haze. Beneath it, the Japanese convoy churned westward, 8 transports and their destroyer escorts cutting through calm water. The sea seemed deceptively peaceful, its surface reflecting the morning sun like glass. Then, high above, came the distant growl of engines. The first Allied wave appeared shortly after 10 a.m. 2, 12 B-17 flying fortresses in tight formation. Their silver bellies caught the light as they descended through the clouds. Japanese lookouts shouted warnings. Bells clanged, and anti-aircraft guns turned skyward. The air filled with black puffs of bursting flak, but the B-17s pressed on. From 6,000 feet, they began their bombing run. Dozens of 500-pound bombs fell in staggered lines, whistling toward the sea. The convoy twisted violently to evade, but the formation was too dense. One transport, the Kyokusei Maru, took a direct hit amidships. Flames erupted from its hull as hundreds of soldiers threw themselves into the water. The destroyer Yukikaze moved in to rescue survivors, but the damage was done. The convoy's tight defensive formation had been broken. That was the moment the second wave arrived. Flying just above the sea at barely 100 feet, American B-25 Mitchells and Australian Beaufighters swept in from multiple directions. Their approach was silent until the last second. Then the roar of engines and gunfire shattered the morning calm. The Beaufighters struck first. Their 20mm cannons tore through ship decks, shredding anti-aircraft gunners before they could respond. Masts splintered, men dove for cover, and chaos rippled through the convoy. Moments later, the B-25s released their bombs, each skipping across the surface like a thrown stone before slamming into steel hulls. Explosions erupted in blinding bursts, tearing ships apart from bow to stern. The Japanese defensive fire was desperate but unfocused. The destroyers tried to zigzag and lay smoke, but the sky and sea were alive with attackers. Some pilots flew so low that salt spray coated their windshields. Others narrowly cleared the masts of burning ships. It was raw, close-quarters destruction. Naval warfare transformed into an aerial slaughter. By noon, multiple transports were ablaze. One after another, they exploded or began to list, spilling oil and debris into the sea. Lifeboats overturned, men clung to wreckage, and the once orderly convoy dissolved into a scattering of flames and smoke. From above, Allied reconnaissance aircraft circled, photographing the devastation in real time. Radio reports streamed back to Port Moresby. Convoy breaking up. Multiple hits. Ships burning. General Kenny listened silently, then gave the order for another wave to finish the job. At sea level, Admiral Kimura realized the scale of the disaster too late. His escorts were overwhelmed, his transports destroyed or crippled. Yet still, he ordered his surviving ships to press on. A futile act of defiance against the overwhelming tide of Allied power now descending upon him. The battle was far from over. The skies over the Bismarck Sea would soon darken again, this time with the final wave that would erase what remained of the convoy. By early afternoon on March 3, 1943, the Bismarck Sea was a scene of chaos and fire. The air smelled of burning oil and cordite. Black smoke rose thousands of feet into the sky, visible for miles. The calm blue waters had turned into a floating graveyard of debris, lifeboats, and bodies. But the assault wasn't over. At 2:30 p.m., the next Allied strike arrived. Another wave of B-25s and A-20 Havocs, escorted by P-38 Lightnings. They descended low, engines roaring, their shadows racing across the water. The Japanese destroyers tried to shield the remaining transports, laying smoke screens and firing everything they had. Tracers streaked upward in thick red lines, but the attackers were already inside the wall of fire. The Americans coordinated their attack with brutal precision. Beaufighters strafed from the front, suppressing the guns. Behind them, B-25 swept in at mast height. Relais, sing bombs at point-blank range. Some planes were so low that they barely cleared the burning masts before climbing again. The Taimei Maru and Oigawa Maru were the next to die. Both took direct hits and erupted into towering pillars of flame. The Teiyo Maru followed, struck by a bomb that detonated its fuel stores. The explosion tore the ship apart, scattering fragments across the sea like shrapnel. One destroyer, the Horatio, collided with a transport while trying to rescue survivors, leaving both ships dead in the water. The Japanese formation disintegrated completely. Some transports tried to beach themselves on nearby islands to escape the onslaught, but Allied fighters hunted them relentlessly. P-38s strafed lifeboats, while B-25s circled back to strike any vessel still afloat. Admiral Kimura, aboard his flagship Shirayuki, watched in disbelief as the convoy he had sworn to protect vanished before his eyes. Moments later, his own ship was hit. The blast tore through the bridge, killing much of his command staff. Kimura himself was wounded, but survived, one of the few senior officers to live through the battle. By late afternoon, the destruction was complete. All 8 Japanese transports were gone. 4 destroyers lay sunk or crippled. The sea burned for hours, lit by the glow of dying fires as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Thousands of Japanese soldiers floated helplessly in the wreckage, many clinging to debris, others drifting silently beneath the waves. When the last Allied aircraft returned to base, their pilots were exhausted, their faces streaked with sweat and salt. Some couldn't believe what they'd seen. An entire convoy wiped from existence in a single day. General Kenny received the final report that evening. The convoy destroyed, losses minimal. He simply nodded. The mission had been a success beyond expectation. Out at sea, the silent once sea returned. Only the crackle of burning oil and the faint cries of survivors remained. In Tokyo, news of the disaster would take days to arrive. But when it did, it would send shockwaves through the Imperial Navy. A realization that for the first time, Japanese sea power could no longer guarantee safety or supply. The Pacific tide had turned, not by battleship guns, but by codebreakers, courage, and the power of the air. When dawn returned to the Bismarck Sea on March 4th, the ocean was still burning. Oil slicks shimmered across the surface, mixed with ash and wreckage. Hundreds of men floated among the debris. Soldiers, sailors, airmen. The survivors of Japan's shattered convoy. Some clung to planks or barrels, their faces blackened by smoke. Others drifted silently, lifeless, their uniforms barely visible beneath the rising sun. For the Allies, the victory was overwhelming. Out of the 16 Japanese ships that had set sail from Rabaul, only 4 destroyers limped back. All 8 transports were gone, sunk, burned, or beached. The Japanese lost over 3,000 men, including almost every soldier bound for Leh. Allied losses were minimal, only a few aircraft damaged or destroyed. At Port Moresby, ground crews and pilots gathered to watch the reconnaissance photos coming in from the battlefield. The images were stark. Columns of smoke, burning wrecks, men adrift in the sea. For the air crews who had flown through the fire, the realization of what they had done came slowly. They had destroyed not just ships, but an entire invasion force, the largest convoy Japan had ever sent to New Guinea. General Kenny congratulated his men, but gave no victory speeches. In his report to General Douglas MacArthur, he wrote simply, "The Japanese convoy has been destroyed. The enemy has suffered complete disaster." At Rabaul, the reaction was disbelief. Admiral Kimura's surviving destroyers arrived battered and scarred, their decks crowded with wounded men. Few could speak of what they had seen. Commanders in Rabaul and Tokyo were stunned. The convoy had sailed under full escort, through bad weather, with strict radio silence. Yet somehow the Allies had known everything: the route, the timing, even the composition of the fleet. The Japanese Army and Navy immediately blamed each other. Naval officers accused the Army of forcing the convoy to sail despite warnings about Allied air superiority. Army staff argued that the Navy had failed to provide enough protection. Behind closed doors, the truth began to emerge. Japan had underestimated Allied code-breaking, radar, and aerial coordination. For the men who survived the battle, the ordeal wasn't over. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers who escaped the sinking ships tried to swim toward nearby islands. Some reached the shore, only to face strafing runs from Allied aircraft the next day. Others drifted for days without food or water, their strength fading under the Pacific sun. By the time rescue efforts began, most were dead. One Australian airman, observing the wreckage from his bowfighter, later recalled, "It wasn't a battle anymore. It was slaughter. The sea was alive with men, and we couldn't help them." For the Allies, the victory confirmed a fundamental truth. The age of the battleship was over. Control of the sea no longer depended on armor or guns. It depended on air power, intelligence, and precision. The Bismarck Sea had proved that aircraft, guided by information and innovation, could annihilate even the most heavily escorted convoys. As General Kenny's final reconnaissance reports were compiled, a pattern became clear. Japan's logistical network in the Southwest Pacific was collapsing. Without supplies and reinforcements, the garrisons at Leh, Salamaua, and Wewak would soon be cut off. The Bismarck Sea was no longer just a battlefield. It had become a graveyard, and a warning of what air dominance could truly achieve. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea changed the Pacific War forever. For Japan, it marked the end of large-scale reinforcement by sea. The Imperial Navy, once confident in its might, now understood that even the strongest convoy was helpless under Allied air power. From that day forward, Japan shifted to night operations and smaller scattered shipments, desperate measures that never recovered the momentum lost in March 1943. For the Allies, the victory validated a new doctrine. Air control was sea control. Precision bombing, low-level strafing, and coordinated intelligence had turned the ocean into a battlefield dominated from the skies. Codebreakers, once silent in their hidden rooms, were now recognized as critical to victory. General MacArthur called the battle the most complete and annihilating victory ever achieved by Allied air forces. It was more than a triumph. It was proof that information and speed could dismantle empires. From the smoldering wrecks of the Bismarck Sea rose a new kind of warfare, one where the enemy's secrets mattered as much as his ships. And it set the stage for the relentless Allied advance that would carry across New Guinea, the Philippines, and eventually, to Japan itself. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands as a turning point, not for its size, but for what it revealed about modern war. It proved that knowledge could strike with the force of bombs, that intelligence could sink fleets before they ever saw the enemy. The Japanese convoy was more than a military operation. It was a symbol of faith in old ways, armor, guns, and courage. But by 1943, warfare had changed. Invisible signals, decoded by unseen hands, had become weapons as decisive as aircraft and artillery. The men who flew above the Bismarck Sea, and those who cracked codes far from the front, shared one victory: the mastery of coordination. The mind and the machine, working as one, had altered the course of history. From that moment on, Japan would fight on the defensive, its naval roots shattered, its secrets no longer safe. And in the silent rooms of Allied codebreakers, there was no celebration, only the steady rhythm of typewriters continuing their work, because they knew the war was far from over, and that the next message could decide the fate of nations.